Well, we're excited, yes, to have our last two incubator speakers. And we're going to start off with Apryle Craig. Apryle is a PhD candidate in the Environmental and Forest Sciences Department. And she did the incubator alongside eScience data scientist Valentina Stanova. April's going to be talking today about, the title of her talk is, this is a great title, Deer Fear, Classifying Deer Behavior Using Accelerometers, Animal-Borne Video, and Machine Learning, with Apryle.
Okay, thank you. Can you guys all hear me? Can I see a thumbs up, just a quick thumbs up if you can hear okay? Great, thanks. Okay, so thanks everyone for coming. So today I'm going to talk about my experience with the Data Incubator program and my project Classifying Deer Behavior Using Accelerometers, Animal-Borne Video, and Machine Learning. A huge thank you to my incubator advisor, Valentina, for her contributions. In the Western US, wolves were extinct by 1930. In 1980, some wolves began to recolonize from Canada. And in 1995, wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park and parts of Idaho. From there, they began dispersing naturally. And in 2008, Washington Fish and Wildlife confirmed the first packs in Washington. Now, we all know that wolves prey primarily on deer and elk, but an increasing number of studies are suggesting that predators like wolves can also have a really big impact on the behavior of their prey. Prey change their behavior to reduce the risk of predation, but these behavior changes can also reduce their fitness. For example, deer may shift habitat to avoid wolves, but find less nutritious plants in the new area. Deer may increase group size to disperse the risk, but this may increase competition for the best foraging patches. And deer may spend more time vigilant to detect threats, but this comes at the cost of other activities. So this vigilance trade-off is the primary focus of my research. Vigilance in deer is characterized by the head up and a pause in all activities. So pausing all activities allows the deer to reduce the chance of being seen and at the same time dedicate all senses to detecting a threat. So if they're pausing all activities, it leaves less time available for fitness enhancing behaviors such as resting, monitoring competitors, mating, or foraging. So my research question is, are deer in wolf recolonized areas of Washington spending more time vigilant at the expense of fitness increasing behaviors? To answer that question, in 2012, we established 4 study sites in northeastern Washington, 2 that were recolonized by wolves that are shown in blue, and 2 without wolves shown in gold. Over the course of 3 winters, we captured deer, both male and female, both mule deer and white-tailed deer, and we outfitted them with collars. The collar was a GPS collar equipped with a GoPro-style video camera and a triaxial accelerometer, kind of like the ones that you would have in a Fitbit. The accelerometers recorded 10 data points per second, or 10 hertz, in each of the 3 planes, so forward and back, up, down, and left, right. The collar was on a deer for 2 weeks, and then it had a timed release mechanism that dropped the collar off so we could redeploy that expensive video camera collar on a different deer. And instead of saving the 2 weeks as continuous video, the camera actually created a new file for every 10 seconds of video. So they were kind of saved into these 10-second chunks. And this whole process resulted in data from 32 deer. Then next we had some trained observers review the video, and generally we tried to review 15 minutes of video per deer per day. And in each 10-second video clip, observers were recording how much time the deer spent in vigilance, bedded, foraging, and traveling behaviors. And I have a few examples of the video. Here's an example of a deer that is bedded. So as you can see, they don't move around a whole lot when they're bedded. And here's an example of a video where the deer is foraging, and then in the middle of the foraging, it picks its head up and pauses in all activities to be vigilant, and then it puts its head back down and goes back to foraging. So after 3 years of video review, we had 22,000 labeled video clips, which unfortunately represents just 1% of the total data. So how can I unlock the other 99%? And that's where the incubator came in. So my incubator goal was, can we use machine learning to assign behavior states to the accelerometry data and unlock the rest of the data set? If so, for future studies, could we just outfit maybe a few deer with the animal-borne video collars, since they're very expensive, and deploy accelerometers on a lot more deer, and use the models with the trained data set on the small number who had the animal-borne video collars, and apply that to other deer? Now, using accelerometers is becoming more popular in ecology to identify animal behavior patterns. And generally, researchers, first, they watch the animal of interest move and identify key movements. Then they would calculate features from acceleration, such as pitch and roll, that might be associated with behaviors that are of particular interest. And then they would use these biological features, often in a random forest model, to predict behaviors from the accelerometer signals. This requires a lot of a priori assumptions about species-specific movement patterns that are associated with the behaviors of interest. So it's very biologically driven and species-specific. The approach we wanted to take was to remove these assumptions. So we converted the accelerometer signal from the time domain to the frequency domain, used principal component analysis to generate principal components of the transformed acceleration, and then used the PCs in a logistic regression model to predict behaviors from the signal. So we didn't need to go through any assumptions with what movements are associated with what behaviors. We really took a more data-driven approach. So recall that the video was saved into these 10-second video clips. We wanted to start out with the most basic case, so just linking one behavior and one video. So from the full 22,000 labeled video clips, we removed all video clips where the deer was engaging in multiple behaviors. For example, that video that I showed where the deer was foraging and then looked up for a little while and then went back to foraging. That was a video that would have gotten culled in this step. We just wanted the most easy case. So this left us with about 8,400 pure behavior video clips and their associated accelerometer data. Looking at examples of two very distinct behaviors, traveling and bedded, we can see that traveling and bedded produced very different acceleration signals. In the traveling figure, you can almost imagine each step the deer takes as it's kind of rhythmically coinciding with a peak or trough in that signal wave. The signals have very different oscillations or frequencies and different amplitudes or peak sizes. So we wanted our model to key in on this pattern of frequencies and amplitudes. At the same time, we wanted our model to disregard when the signal happens in time. In other words, if we shifted that traveling signal to the left or right on the graph in time, we still wanted our model to recognize it as traveling. So we wanted to transform these data from the time domain to the frequency domain. We used a Fourier transform for this. So one accelerometer signal is actually made up of a bunch of sine waves, each with its own frequency and amplitude. And the Fourier transform takes a time-based pattern like the accelerometer signal and decomposes it into the individual signals that make it up. The frequency and amplitude of the individual signals can then be mapped onto the frequency domain. So here's an example of an accelerometer signal in the time domain. And here it is after we transformed it into the frequency domain. And you can see that we did this for each of the 3 axes independently. Next, we split our labeled data into training, validation, and test data sets. To create these, we actually created the test data set first by withholding 4 deer that will not be included in training the model. These test deer will allow us to see how the model performs on new deer, so we can get an idea of whether future researchers could deploy fewer video camera collars and accelerometers on many deer. From the remaining 28 deer, we withheld 10% of the videos for validation. That left about 6,300 videos for training the model. We took our predictor variables from the training data. Remember that the predictor variables in this case are actually the points that are generated from the Fourier transform. And we used principal component analysis to reduce the dimensionality to 25 principal components. We plotted these principal components against each other. Here we see PC1 versus PC2. And then if we color the points according to their behavior, we can identify distinct clusters and overlap. Here we can kind of see that there's a bit of overlap, quite a bit of overlap between vetted and vigilance. And thinking down the road, this may make it difficult for our models to distinguish between these 2 behaviors. So we calculated quite a few principal components, but are they all important to include in our model? Here we can see the proportion of explained variance for each principal component, and we see that PC1 explains the most variation, and PCs 2, 3, and 4 are also somewhat useful. So we included the first 4 principal components as predictor variables in a logistic regression model. Next, we did a second principal component analysis, this time using only the validation data to get the principal components. Then we used these PCs in the logistic regression model to predict behavior for the validation data set. Here we see a confusion matrix with the model predicted behaviors horizontally and the true behavior state, which was observed in the videos, shown in the vertical axis. The model did a great job at predicting vetted. It correctly classified about 3,000 videos. In 127 cases, the model predicted foraging when the deer was actually vetted. The model also did a pretty good job at predicting foraging. It correctly classified over 2,000 videos. In this case, most of the miscategorized foraging videos were incorrectly categorized as vetted. The model did okay at predicting traveling. It mislabeled many of the traveling videos as foraging. Unfortunately, the model did a terrible job at predicting vigilance. It incorrectly labeled most of the vigilance as vetted. This was somewhat expected since the visual inspection of the principal component analysis showed a lot of overlap between bedded and vigilance. And if you think about it biologically, in both cases, the deer is probably being very still. But this is really bad news for my ecological question, since vigilance is critical to understanding this behavioral trade-off that I'm trying to understand. So the next step is for us to consider separating the static and dynamic components of acceleration. So when you have this accelerometer signal or this acceleration signal, there's a component of it, the static component, that's due to the acceleration, the orientation of the animal and the gravitational acceleration. And then there's a component that's actually due to the movement, the body movement of the animal, and that's the dynamic component. And since some studies have shown that static acceleration can provide information about animal orientation. So since the animal's bedded and laying down, it may have a different orientation than when it's vigilant and standing. So that might help us to distinguish between those two behaviors. Another next step is to then expand to include video clips with multiple behaviors and hopefully be able to not just assign one behavior category to one 10-second video clip, because a lot of the behaviors are a lot more nuanced than that. In that example video that we watched, within that 10 seconds, the deer was foraging, spent some time vigilant, and then went back to foraging. And so what one of the next steps is to be able to predict the proportion of time spent within a video dedicated to each behavior. Another step is to use that test data set to determine if fewer deer could be outfitted with video collars. And I hope to create a carpentry lesson and hopefully make this process more accessible to ecologists. So I want to, again, thank my data incubator advisor, Valentina, and the eScience Institute for holding this program. I made a ton of progress and learned an awful lot during those 10 weeks and couldn't have done all of this without you guys, so really appreciate it. And with that, I will take questions.
Thank you, April. I have a quick question to get us started. What is the sampling frequency of the accelerometer that you use, and how did that enter into your FFTs?
The accelerometers recorded at 10 hertz, so 10 points per second. So during a 10-second video, that had 100 accelerometer points associated with it. We actually experimented with, when we did the transformation into the frequency domain, we could choose our smoothing parameter. And a great next step would maybe be to fiddle with that a little bit more to see how that smoothing parameter may impact the rest of the analysis. But on kind of cursory examination, it looked like the peaks were still falling out around the same frequencies. So I think the main signal was being captured kind of no matter how much smoothing we used for that. And then did that fully answer your question, or what was the other component to it?
Nope, that was a very thorough answer to my question. Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions? Erin.
Hi, thanks for the talk. That was really cool. I was wondering, kind of on your second bullet point for the next steps, I thought that made a lot of sense, like a great idea to have kind of like the multiple like behaviors in one clip. And I was wondering if you thought that like almost noticing.
I'm sorry, you cut out.
Like stop and then go back to it. Oops, sorry.
I'm
I
sorry, you
lost like
cut
the
out.
last 10 seconds of what you were saying. Can you repeat it, please?
Oh no. I was asking about if the if it might be possible to kind of like detect a state change between different behaviors, like if it went from foraging and then all of a sudden stopped and then went back, like maybe like is that possible to identify from the data you have?
Yes, I think that state changes might be another possible approach. And I think we also looked at kind of some hidden Markov models and semi-hidden Markov models as different approaches for going forward with this. But sort of a state change or behavior change point analysis could be a good approach for these mixed behavior videos.
Very cool.
Thank you, Erin. Isabel?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could go back to your slide with your matrix of correct and incorrect classifications.
Can you see it?
Yeah, I can see it. I have a question for you about this. So if you look at these numbers, you can see that they're heavily skewed towards bedded and foraging. And I was wondering if you tried this at all with reweighting it so that you had equal numbers of each one.
We have not tried that yet, and that's a great observation and suggestion, because the deer spend a lot of their time laying down.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the data set was definitely heavily skewed with bedded videos. So of course, it's going to be able to learn to predict bedded most accurately. So that's a great comment and something that we should try going forward.
Yeah, and you could also do it like using an ensemble approach where you can like randomly select which bedded and foraging you want and see how that varies. So
Okay.
you say like, because you're going to be selecting your subset of bedded and foraging of samples. Yeah, because yeah.
Great. Yeah, I'll definitely look into that. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's great. So we can get in two more questions. Andrew?
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Actually, both of my questions were pretty much just asked. So with that, I guess I have one last thought that I'm interested in your response. So like you said about state change, you could use like a Markov or hidden Markov type situation. Have you considered doing something even more simple and just doing like a time delay embedding and just like say like if 10 seconds ago the signal was bedded, it's probably still bedded, like not even doing Markov, but just simpler?
Yes. So that was something that Valentina was sort of helping me implement as we were wrapping things up. And because when it's bedded, it tends to stay bedded for quite a long period of time. So even just looking back one step would be helpful probably for predicting what the next behavior is.
And I think we can fit in Connor.
Just a quick question. Are you still collecting this data? And if so, would you choose to measure different things? Like, I guess like what I'm thinking is whether like a deer's foraging or vigilant, that might be like an elevation thing. Like where if you had a GPS that could measure like, you know, head comes up 3 feet and stays there, you know, for a minute, then I'm just curious if like in going through all this, you were wishing you had measured different things and what those might be.
So the deer were outfitted, the collar that they had actually did have GPS. So we have 2 point GPS locations per day for each deer, which doesn't help us with this fine scale, very nuanced behavior, try to tease that apart. A few of the deer had very fine scale GPS where it actually took 1 GPS point per second, but this malfunctioned on the majority of the deer. So we probably only have 4 deer where it actually worked, and it only worked on them part of the time. But it will be really interesting to add an additional data stream like GPS to try to see if that helps to improve the models. I'm sure it will in some ways. But another thing that I was really interested in was, and we approached our whole modeling approach with this goal too, is to make it general enough that someone doesn't need fine scale GPS, that accelerometers are really pretty cheap. And so the more we can maximize what we get out of these accelerometers alone, the more data we can collect because we have the funds to deploy them on more animals. So as far as including another data stream, I can definitely do that to answer my own ecological questions, but kind of this whole methods approach, I'd like to keep it as general as possible and see what we can learn from accelerometry alone, basically.
Yeah, I agree. That's an interesting problem.
Yeah.
So in the interest of time, I know that there are more questions. April, I can let you know who has more questions for you, but it'd be great if we could move on to Rose.